All right. So I want to quick thanks for you guys having me here today. I want to thank Katie Dagon. We met at the Capitol when we presented some science data for the politicians, and she said, you should come up here and talk to us at NCAR and UCAR. So I'm really excited to be here. And this research comes out of a lot of what most of you probably see on a daily basis when it comes to talking about climate change on Facebook, with your uncles, and in the classroom. And the messages that those individuals may give you about climate change and maybe say why your research isn't as hot as you think it is, and how that may affect people's belief in climate change. So here's a quick rundown of the talk today. We'll do a quick introduction about pseudoscience, look at what the literature says, because we kind of draw from a couple different groups. Take a look at a couple problem statements, the methodology that we used, look at some results and discussions, which is the meat and potatoes of the talk, and then go on to some conclusions, some take-home messages. So with the introduction. So myself and our group are really interested in pseudoscience, which, as you guys would guess, is fake science. It's ideas that are presented as science but are anything but. And a couple examples of this would be like astrology, GMO hysteria, essential oils, which comes up a lot in my classrooms. I have a lot of students that sell this stuff. Great start. And there's nothing wrong with nice smelling oils, but Young Living, he was selling this stuff in Africa as a cure for Ebola, right? And a bunch of these essential oil companies are making claims that these can cure diseases, which in lies the problem. Smelling nice, that's all great. My fiance is a medical midwife, and this comes up a lot. The anti-vaxxer group is another type of pseudoscience. Young Earth creationism is an example that comes a lot in my geology classes. And then you can't teach mineralogy without crystal healing coming up a lot, right? And we see the anti-climate change messages as another type of pseudoscience. They're taking science and twisting it, or they're coming up with misinformation that sounds scientific to convince the public that climate change is not a reality or a threat. Here's the picture there. So let's take a look quickly at the problem of disacceptance when it comes to climate change. People saying that they understand climate change has been increasing throughout the years. Those who believe that warming is taking place is around 67%. This number is a little old, but it's actually a little lower now, unfortunately. But those who believe that climate change is caused by humans sit somewhere around 61 and 50%. And I'm an educator. I'm an education researcher, and if I were to give this kind of a grade for kind of a low bar, just accepting that climate change is happening and we're involved, I'd have to give it an F, right? And that's a big problem, and you guys all know that. I feel like I'm preaching to the choir here. And why? Why is this? I was at GSA in Seattle this year, and I saw Michael Mann talk about sea level curves and some really kick-ass climate science. And then at the end of the session, everyone raised their hand, and the first question, the second question, the third question, the fourth question was, why don't people believe in climate change? No one asked questions about the science behind climate change itself. They were more interested in why is there this difference between the public and what scientists know from the research. And the short story is this misinformation we're going to be focusing on today. It's very hard for people to come up with really accurate climate information if they just go to the internet, right? If you pull out your Google phone and you say, hey, is climate change real? Hey, Google, is climate change real? It'll say yes. The debate is over about whether or not climate change is real. Irrefutable evidence from around the world, including extreme weather events, yada, yada, yada. Although look at the imagery that pops up when you ask that question, right? If you only got to the picture and that was it, you may have some, confusion. And then those always trying to show up at the same time with those. Although the scary part is if you pull out your phone and you say, hey, Google, is global warming real? It'll tell you no. Scientists could not reach a consensus on whether or not global warming is real, which is really scary to think that, imagine you're an interested party and you just switch two words around in your search. You may come up with very different answers. And Google, this comes up because they're just pulling the first search result, right? And just kind of give you an answer from there. But this is scary and very hard for a lot of people to contend with, to understand what's real and what isn't. And then some of you may be familiar with this. This is why scientists disagree about global warming, the NIPCC's report on the scientific consensus. I'm going to laugh today. This went out to somewhere between 22 and 30,000 high school, middle school, and some college teachers right after Trump was elected. This is produced by the Heartland Institute, and it's made to look exactly like the real IPCC report on the inside. I have one. they are really slick looking. And you can imagine this showed up at times when a lot of teachers are going to have to teach climate change for the first time in their curriculum with the adoption of next-gen science standards in a lot of states. And imagine your teacher has never taught climate change before. You need materials to teach said topic, and then this shows up in your mailbox and all this great free information. If you didn't have the tools to know that this is bullshit, then you may be confused, and you may make some mistakes and pass on some of this misinformation to your students, which does happen. So I noticed, and I'm sure many of you have noticed, that a lot of the arguments against climate change are very canned. You hear the same messages over and over again. This happens in the classroom, on Facebook, in debates on TV. It's the sun, it's cooling, it's no doubt, it's a cycle. And there are resources that are out there that help refute this. I've used skeptical science too, and I think I'm chatting with a Russian bot on Facebook, and I don't want to put a lot of time in. I'll just pop one of these links in, right, as to kind of refute these canned arguments, which is great. However, there are a few unanswered questions which we're going to gather here from the literature review. So where do these messages come from, right? I'm sure a lot of you guys could guess. But this is the key components of the climate change dissension machine from Dunlap McWright. This came from the Oxford Handbook of Climate Change and Society. And it's a framework for how messages enter what they refer to as the echo chamber. So we have essentially the money at the top here. These organizations fund conservative think tanks and front groups that either come up with this misinformation themselves or promote contrarian scientists who spread this misinformation. And then that misinformation enters the echo chamber and it bounces around between the internet. You see it on Facebook, you see it on the news, you see politicians say it sometimes. And I have denial crossed out right there because if you guys don't take anything home today besides this, I think we should stop using that word. It's meant to be extremely derogatory and elicit essentially Holocaust denier, which is where people pulled it from. I won't use it in this talk. I use the word dissenter because it's a far more accurate. Skeptic doesn't work. Denier is kind of mean. Dissenter kind of makes the most sense. And I kind of use the example when I teach plate tectonics to my students. When I get to the end of the unit, if I have a student that doesn't get it, right, that just didn't understand plate tectonics by the end of the talk, I don't call them a plate tectonic denier, right? They just, some misinformation got in there, they didn't get a concept, and then they just don't understand. The majority of Americans, they're not believing in climate change to be mean to you. They just have been misled in some way or have some misinformation in their schema. So I'll get off my soapbox real quick. We'll wait till the end for questions. Is that all right? All right. So this framework may seem a little bit like tinfoil hatty, that there's like this big brother that's making all this misinformation happen, but there's a lot of evidence that this is occurring. The first author there looked at how industries are funded using publicly available data, and these groups are heavily funded by carbon-heavy industries. Right around when climate policies pop up or world organizations start talking about climate change policies. And Dunlap and Jacques found that almost all the anti-climate change books are published by conservative think tanks or affiliates, or former affiliates with conservative think tanks. So this isn't too far-fetched. All right, so conservative think tanks is where a lot of this misinformation comes from. They tend to be the root of a lot of these messages, and we'll see that a little bit more later. So do these messages work against the efforts of educators? These are policy groups. Is this just policy information that they're pointing out and why we shouldn't invoke some kind of climate policy? And only 3 papers that I know of have actually gone in and done analysis of the messages that these groups produce. McWright and Dunlap looked at conservative websites in the 1990s for, 6 or 7 years, and then published in 2000 a list of dissenter messages there, and they categorized it into 3 broad categories. Morales and I think it's Cohn they essentially reproduced their study, but with computers, because there's a lot more web pages now than there were in the 90s. And then me and a few colleagues actually went to YouTube and used a way to hide ourselves from YouTube so that we would come to YouTube as a fresh face every time, and kind of looked at what information on there. And some of those videos get hundreds of millions of views and thousands of shares, and those are the ones that we looked at to kind of see where these dissenter messages are in the echo chamber. And short story is that these messages do work against the efforts of science educators. Here's a couple examples. We have from the GLOC evidence, absolutely no evidence that carbon dioxide has driven climate. I don't know why these guys are bears, but this got a bunch of views, millions of views. Some satellite data and sunspot analysis is actually leading some scientists to predict Another mini ice age is coming soon. The sun seems to be starting a solar minimum, and this well explains why winters are becoming so much more severe. And then this young lady who had a lot of views. Scientists will even tell you there's a political agenda behind this. Instead of dealing with the science and the environment, this is politics. That's what it is. And these two gentlemen from the Great Global Warming Swindle, I'm sure some of you guys are familiar. This was a BBC documentary about why climate change isn't real. And the first gentleman says scientists need there to be a problem in order to get funding. And the second says we have a vested interest in creating panic because money will flow to climate science, like it's the movie 2012 or something. So short story, these efforts are working against the efforts of science educators. They are attacking the science. They're not just policy groups. Next question is, how are these messages spread? Do I have to go to YouTube and type in climate change is a hoax over and over again to find these messages? Do I have to go to the Heartland Institute's website and read their pages to get this misinformation? And the short answer here is no, for a few reasons. Boycroft and Boycroft talk about the bias as balance. Journalistic norms of having like a fair argument unintentionally create bias. And John Oliver spoofed this a couple of years ago on his show with the dueling scientists and how that doesn't make any sense. Wilson interviewed a bunch of environmental reporters and found that almost all those reporters got their information on climate change or the environment from other reporters and news articles, which is a little scary because, you know, imagine one of those little dissenter messages pops into the echo chamber. It can get circular reported really fast. And then Feldman found that some news sources are more biased than others. I'll let you guess. But this is going to come up again here in a minute. So it's important, and I try to explain this to teachers, that your students are going to have heard dissenter messages in some way or another before they get to your classroom. There's no way they're coming in on a blank slate with this one. And it's important to understand that, you know, we maybe should address these in the classroom. And then the last question is, are these messages actually effective? Are these just part of the echo chamber and the people that hear them are the people that kind of already are going to agree with them, or are these actually affecting people's acceptance of anthropogenic climate change, and are they more effective with certain groups, right? And that's kind of where we stepped in with our study. So let's take a look at a few problem statements here. The first one, you know, are anti-anthropogenic climate change messages produced by organized climate change ascension effective at convincing the public that anthropogenic climate change is not a reality or a threat? In other words, from an educator's perspective, should science educators work to inoculate students from anti-climate change messages in the classroom? I have a couple hypotheses and research questions that we use to kind of guide our research. The first was agreement with dissenter messages will be higher among conservatives, those who select conservative news as their primary news source, and those at lower education levels. These are the people that I kind of gathered that from in the literature. And agreement with dissenter knowledge will be a better predictor for dismissing anthropogenic climate change than political ideology. There's a kind of a big argument between the public understanding of science people, the science communication people, and science educators. Educators think that they see climate change dissension as a deficit model. You know, if people just understand climate change better, they wouldn't reject it. Where the people that do the public understanding of science dismiss knowledge entirely. They say, you know, knowledge is an effective predictor of dissent. And a lot of times, unfortunately, when they come up with those arguments, it's because they use like self-assessed knowledge. They'll just ask people how much you know about climate change. They say a lot. They say, well, these people knew a lot, and they dissented. And they're saying the knowledge isn't a thing. And I just think, man, if I gave my students a final exam like that, it would never work. So I thought, you know, maybe agreement with dissenter knowledge or pseudoscience knowledge may be the key here, the predictor, instead of just accurate knowledge, if that makes sense. We also looked at what type of dissenter messages identified by the instrument that we developed is most correlated with climate change dissent. So what category or theme of dissenter messages is the best predictor for dissent, if you agree with it? Other predictors for dissent, similar or dissimilar for various groups of individuals as categorized by demographics. Are these messages, you know, more effective with older Americans, younger Americans, men, women, that kind of idea? And then, does the level of agreement with dissenter messages vary by participants' primary news source outside of their own political affiliation? This is like, what's more important, who you're listening to or who you identify with, if that makes sense, right? So let's take a look at the methodology real quick. Take a drink. So we distributed and analyzed the instrument. I have a couple copies here if anybody's interested at the end of the talk. The Anthropogenic Climate Change Dissenter Inventory, which gauges an individual's belief in several categories of dissenter messages. And we use multivariate logistic regression analysis to try to figure out what the best predictor was. This is a two-phase mixed methods approach. This may be not something you guys in the natural sciences are used to. We use qualitative data, those YouTube videos, to develop the instrument that we redistribute then for analysis and interpretation. This is an example, a little piece of the instrument. They were given blocks of 5 questions at a time, and then have to scroll and do another 5 blocks of questions. It's a forced choice Likert scale. There's no middle option. And in fact, we dichotomized this data at the end anyway. You either agreed or disagreed. It was kind of like a false choice there. But you either were on the agree side or disagree side at the end. That just makes the numbers a little easier to crunch later. So the message categories that we identified in the earlier study after watching the YouTube videos, we made an instrument that was, 100 items long, and then we gave it to the public in a couple iterations for confirmatory and factor analysis, and that kind of distilled down how people answer these items, and it kind of factors them into groups. The first category were naive scientific messages. These are kind of the low bar arguments against climate change, that climate and weather gets conflated, or that we have people saying that winters are cold, therefore climate change isn't real, or that CO2 and climate isn't related at all. They're kind of the easily dismissed ones. The non-scientific statements were the hardest to watch. They were the ones that kind of attack the science and say that, we all do this research and we make it up so that we can drive our, really fancy cars and fly our private jets around. That scientists don't actually use the data that they collect. They modify the data to get the results they want. Those kind of arguments. Sophisticated scientific statements are the ones that kind of agree that climate change is happening but remove the human element. It's the sun, it's volcanoes, it's ocean circulation, it's intergalactic solar radiation, it's where the plates are for like plate tectonics. The Mother Nature statements kind of remove our ability to change the climate. This is, well, the Earth produces way more carbon dioxide than us, so we can't possibly be making a difference, or that nature will figure itself out. It's kind of this, ominous being that will fix climate on our behalf. Climate change is beneficial for mankind. CO2 is plant food. We'd have longer growing seasons, and we would be able to grow way more food, right, if there was more CO2 in the atmosphere. I'm sure people in Michigan agree with that one a lot. And then recent changes are part of our larger cycle. In a lot of the videos that we watched, they would show the ice age cycles and be zoomed way out, and they would show, oh, look, it's just a sine wave, and we're just cresting the hump, and we'll be going down soon without zooming in and seeing us bucking that trend, right? I'm sure many of you are familiar with these, have heard them before. This is kind of how they factor together. This is the loading for the instrument with the confirmatory factor analysis. The first 2 categories loaded together because it kind of makes sense that people that would agree with naive scientific messages would also agree with messages that attack science because they're just not in the know when it comes to how science is done. But we broke this up kind of artificially because if you're teaching in a classroom, you're going to tackle those ideas separately when you try to fix a student schema. So our population came from Amazon Mechanical Turk. Is anybody familiar with this resource? All right. So Amazon Mechanical Turk, anyone can sign up for it, and it was designed by Amazon so that companies can have human workers do very small tasks for menial wages. So, if you ever fill out a paper form by hand, it'll get scanned into a computer, and then the company will upload it, and then you can say, I want to do that task, and you'll type in what's in each box, and you'll earn like a nickel. They're essentially tasks that computers can't do that they need people to do. But social scientists quickly realized that this is a great way to get surveys out there, because I can distribute 100 surveys on Amazon Mechanical Turk and have them filled up by the public in the matter of an hour, right? And pretty cheaply. So the data collection is really fast. It's really inexpensive. I think I paid my participants 30 cents a survey, and they took a couple minutes, 10 minutes to do if they did it fully. It's far more representative than a convenience sample, like if I just given this in a classroom, which is what we're doing now, though. It unfortunately underrepresents individuals that are really religious for some reason. We really don't know why that one, but it underrepresents older Americans and Americans of color and Americans that have low social economic status, because you have to have a computer, time to kill on it, and to fill out a lot of these surveys and do these tasks. And older Americans and individuals that don't have the resources to have a computer and time to kill on it tend not to be on Amazon Mechanical Turk very often, right? So we distributed this instrument. We excluded participants from the confirmatory and exploratory factor analysis phase so that everyone who saw the instrument in this particular round were seeing it fresh. No one saw it before. We collected about 900 surveys, but we retained just under 700. Those who failed attention check questions, those who filled the survey out too quickly were sanitized, as well as those who didn't complete the entire survey. Our stats program, if you have blank values, you had to kind of toss them out. The dependent variable was, do you believe that humans are driving the current warming of Earth's climate? This isn't a great way to ask this question. I know that. If anybody raises their hand. We also had a Likert item that said how involved are humans, and it went from human involved to not human involved. And the difference between saying yes to this and human involved with the second question was like, the difference was like less than 1% of people answering differently. So we were kind of excited we asked it 2 different ways. And the dependent variable were the factor scores on the ACCDI and the demographic variables. So let's look at the results, the fun part. So hypothesis 1 was agreement will be higher among conservatives, those who select conservative news as their primary news source, and those at low education levels. And surprise, surprise, conservatives, by and large, agreed with the center messages far more than liberal individuals did. And what students' t-test p-value came out 0. Don't be scared by those error bars with these instruments that are forced choice. You know, some people said yes to every item, and some people said no to every item, right? And I didn't trim those off. That's just one standard deviation. Age was really suggestive. We used the median age of 40 because that was the average age of our population at a p-value of 0.07. I imagine that if we had made it baby boomers versus millennials, we would have kind of gotten a little bit more significant. But older Americans, on average, do agree more with the center messages than younger Americans. Here's where it gets a little tricky. Education, there wasn't any relationship between your level of education or the number of science classes you've taken post-high school, which, you know, was a little shocking at first, but if you think about it, it kind of makes sense. You can take all the chemistry classes in the world, but if you've never taken a climate change course, you probably wouldn't be able to identify misinformation with climate change, because you have to remember, and I didn't point this out really in the beginning, there are people whose whole job it is at conservative think tanks to come up with dissenter information, and they're really good at it. I mean, I was reading and watching these videos, and I ended up going to Wikipedia a lot and being like, is that true? And be like, oh, I see what they did. You know, the upper atmosphere isn't warming. If you looked it up, it's true. So, you know, that was an argument against climate, even though it's an argument for climate change. So they're really good at what they do. So, you know, unless you take a climate change course, I don't think there's any way to really know that some of this misinformation is, in fact, misinformation. And then if you look at primary news source, this was One Way Nova. Yes, yeah, you're like, oh, yeah, yeah. So if you watch Fox News as your primary news source, you agree with dissenter messages way more than any other news source. This was found in the Feldman paper that I mentioned earlier. People who chose Fox News as their primary news source tend to have, they weren't looking at like accurate knowledge or belief, they were looking at climate change like perceptions, and they found that your perceptions of climate change are way lower. You cared way less if you watched Fox News as your primary news source. And that's going to come back up again later here in a minute. The second hypothesis, agreement with dissenter knowledge will be a better predictor for dismissing anthropogenic climate change than political ideology. This is the idea of what's more important, who you identify with, or your belief in some kind of knowledge system. Now, we use the stepwise analysis, so these are the dissenter factors that remained, but political ideology, because farther from 0 is better here. Political ideology was the best predictor for dismissing climate change when we compared it next to dissenter knowledge. We'll put it that way. So I had to reject this one, but it's important to know that these items still remained in the model when we were running it. So they are influencing some individuals, but they're not the best predictor for the population. Does that make sense, everyone? All right. What type of dissenter message, as identified by your instrument, is the most correlated with climate change dissent? And agreeing with the fact that the idea that climate change is just a cycle was the best predictor for dissent. It was actually one of the smaller factors, but it was really, really potent. Some examples would be the recent warming of Earth's atmosphere and oceans as a result of natural climate cycles, and that climate is headed into an ice age was one of the authentic statements on the instrument, and that the recent rapid warming of Earth's atmospheres and oceans is only a result of natural climate cycles. There's another example. Another interesting thing that we haven't been able to explain yet is differences within demographics. Men kind of followed the trend and agreed that the cycle messages were the best predictor for dissent, but for women and younger Americans, the nature arguments were the best predictor for dissent. And we're not sure why this is, but I imagine that younger Americans and women tend to buy into more the natural argument when it comes to healing and vaccines, and then maybe extend into climate change views as well, although we don't have a good explanation for that yet. And then when it came to conservatives versus liberals, I was a little surprised about this. I thought that conservatives would agree more with the anti-science messages because they tend to be the biggest ones that come up on places like Fox News. But it was cycle messages, and if you notice, the loading is actually lower for conservatives than it is for liberals, and that's probably because believing the center messages doesn't impact them as much because they've kind of already made up their mind about climate change from other outside sources, if that makes sense. But for liberals, it's a really strong predictor because belief in dissenter messages have to outweigh their political ideology for them to make the jump from not accepting climate change. Research question 3, does the level of agreement with dissenter messages by participants' primary news source outside their own political affiliation? So this is, who do you trust, or who do you listen to, or who do you identify with? And it was really, this is the exciting part for me, because this is the model if we leave it as is. Political ideology, if you put in primary news source, actually gets washed out. It doesn't, wouldn't retain in the model based on the criteria we set up in the beginning. So primary news source, I mean, 1.104 is the strongest predictor for dissent among our population. It actually outweighed political ideology, which I wasn't expecting. I thought this was going to be, the big ticket item through, but it actually kind of falls out of the model, and we're left with item agreement and primary news source, which has lots of implications for when you teach climate change to students and in the public. So let's take a look at some take-home messages here. That was fast. All right, so hypothesis 1, agreement with dissenter messages would be, it was higher among conservatives, it was higher among those who select conservative news as their primary news source, but not those at lower education levels. Hypothesis 2, agreement with dissenter messages will be a better predictor for dismissing anthropogenic climate change and political ideology. Political ideology was a stronger factor, not your buy into that anti-knowledge. And then what type of message as identified in an instrument, kind of taking out the political ideology, is the best predictor for dissent, and it's agreeing with the idea that climate change is just a cycle. When I talk to teachers, the average teacher that incorporates climate change into their curriculum only spends about an hour on it a year, right? So if you're going to only have an hour window to teach climate change in your class, and you don't want to get into the nitty-gritty, make sure students walk out knowing that we're bucking the trend and that current warming isn't just part of a cycle. It's kind of the most important thing that I talk to them about. Are the predictors for dissent similar for various groups of individuals as categorized by demographics? Pledging nature is a strong predictor for women and younger participants, and older participants were the only ones that were swayed by the naive messages and the idea that those messages were retained in the model. Which probably makes sense because these individuals are the farthest removed from an educational setting and would know the basic climate change information that younger Americans may possess. And then as we talked about a second ago, news sources are a stronger predictor than political affiliation, which I think has lots of implications for how we handle teaching climate change and how we research climate change in the educational world. So this project has some limitations we'll talk about real quick before we go into the take-home messages. Dissenter messages likely have a shelf life. Although a lot of the messages that were found in the 2000 paper by Dylan McWright were the same messages that I came up with when I was doing YouTube videos that had come out 2 weeks prior. They may have a little bit different theme, like they found that climate change is just a scam to get people to vote for the Clintons, and I found that climate change is just a scam to get people to vote for Democrats in general, Barack Obama. But contributing to the sun, contributing it to ocean currents, those things were in the messages back then in the 90s, and they're still here today. But like I said, there are people whose entire job it is to come up with these messages. They're very good at it, and I imagine that, at the next scandal or something like that, they'll be able to jump onto something and run with something like ClimateGate. Amazon Mechanical Turk workers are not highly representative of the U.S. population, so I can't talk about religious individuals, and that's a big kind of fight in the climate change perceptions world, because some people say that if the more religious you are, the more concerned you are about the planet, but it really depends on what church you go to or what sect of Christianity. Evangelicals tend to believe in climate change far lower than Catholics, probably because Catholics have good stewardship as part of their trip to heaven there. Knowing, I mean, it's true. That's really true. I'm a Catholic. I know. I got to be real good to go to heaven. There's no way of knowing why people are agreeing with these messages when they see them. Are they at face value, or because they've heard the information before? Are they seeing the message and being like, wow, that's really convincing, I'm going to agree with it? Or it's like, oh, no, I heard about this before. This is true. I'm going to agree with it. We're redistributing the instrument now to pre-service teachers here in Colorado, because I think all people, I think they're the ones we got to catch early to make sure they don't buy into this dissenter information. And part of the survey is interviewing students to see if we can answer this question. Have you heard this information before? Where do you get your climate information from? And or are you agreeing with these items just because they sound super slick? So some implications. The role of the science, what is the role of the science educator when it comes to climate change education? And I think most people would agree that even though political ideology is a very strong predictor, it's not the only predictor. And as we demonstrated, those other factors were involved in people's choice. So effective instruction should include time dedicated to inoculating students from misinformation, making it very clear to students by the time they leave your classroom that it is not a cycle. We're bucking the cycle. This isn't going to fix itself in any time soon. We should spend time discussing why groups of individuals would spread misinformation instead of just dismissing like, oh, that's just fake news. That's just you just watch too much of X, Y, Z news. But actually talking about things like free market ideology and why this misinformation is spread. Why would your trusted source mislead you on this topic? We need to talk about climate change in the context of society. I think most of you guys would agree with me on that. Talk about the winners and losers of climate policies. And most of us, almost everyone will be a winner, but there are individuals that get a lot of TV time. I'm from Pennsylvania, from coal country. Those individuals will be losers when it comes to climate policies in the short run, especially, because that's their livelihood. We need to not ignore that. Another thing that wasn't necessarily come up from this study, but something I see a lot when I observe teachers and they teach climate change, we need to reframe how climate action and sustainability works, because too often than not, I see teachers frame climate change action as good versus evil. If you do climate things that will help reduce your carbon footprint, you're good. If you don't, you're bad. And I think some teachers don't recognize that the vast majority of Americans can't make huge life changes to improve their carbon footprint. You can't buy a new fridge if you rent a house. You can't buy energy efficient windows if you rent a house. You can't go out and buy a hybrid car or a car that's going to get better gas mileage if you lack the social capital to do so. And if you reframe things as doing so is good and not as bad, it's a lot easier to live with yourself if you reject the reality of climate change than if you accept that you are a bad person based on this framework, if that makes sense, everyone. Then I guess you kind of distill it down as science educators must teach more than just the science. More often than not, especially when we talk about things like evolution and other issues like that, teachers hate bringing up the fact that there are people that don't believe in that when they teach. They like to just stick with the science and kind of let students come up with their own decision. When we interview teachers, they tend to say this, oh, I'm just going to let students come up with their own conclusions after I teach them just the science, because obviously, after they got the science, they're going to get it, right? As we see here, that might not be the case. This kind of brings up the question, and the reason this is a hard lesson in climate education is that it kind of begs the question, what theoretical framework is appropriate for education research when it comes to climate change? I was in the camp of the kind of knowledge deficit model when I started this project. I didn't say this stuff, but I thought, if we taught students and the public more accurate climate information, that the dissenters wouldn't have any ground to stand on, because they're not going up there and saying, I don't believe in climate change because I'm a conservative. a Christian might say when it comes to evolution. They say, I don't believe in climate change because of X, Y, Z pseudoscience, right? And I thought maybe we could pull that rug out, they wouldn't have ground to stand on, and people would accept climate change because they'd have that accurate information, and that doesn't seem to be the case. But I kind of see these kind of arguments on Facebook from prominent scientists sometimes. They'll say things like, if they'd only look at the data, your source is fake news, or you're a denier, these messages are not going to work to convince the public that climate change is a reality. I want to put X through that. I've kind of jumped on this I don't want to say bandwagon because I don't know how many people are doing it, but this idea of social cognitive theory by Bandura, which states that actions which extends into beliefs are modeled after those you trust. And this is going to change how we talk about climate change, especially if you get in a one-on-one scenario, which I'm sure some of you do on Facebook because you all really care about what you do and you want people to believe your research. But saying things like the majority of insert their group here believes in climate change because, we like to poke fun at, sometimes the number of conservatives that don't believe in climate change is more than the number of liberals that don't believe in climate change. The number of conservatives that believe in climate change is very high relative to the ones that don't believe in climate change. So, pointing that out is a very powerful message. And a lot of this comes from George Marshall's book, Don't Even Think About It, Why Our Brains Are Wired to Not Believe in Climate Change. So I can pass it on if anyone's interested. But it does jive with the social cognitive theory. Consider the amount of resources, a considerable amount of resources are dedicated to organized dissension because saying, not just saying, oh, your news is fake news, say, you know what, there are people in your organization that tend to spread this information because, they believe in a free market ideology that does not jive with climate policies. We need to get past that because the free market ideology can work with climate policies, and here's how. A very powerful message is I do not believe in climate change as well. When I first heard it, when I was an undergrad at my school, I'm a little upset you said it now, and I'm going to say this. My faculty members told me that climate change was not real. I was taught that climate change was not real, and they would do the math on the board. I don't want to point out which professors, chemistry. And I had to come with terms that climate change was a reality myself. And I find that, I said, hey, man, I'm not just on this team. I joined that team because my wall of misinformation got knocked down after a while, and I started seeing kind of the light here and talking about how it's okay to change your mind and come to our team is a very powerful way to talk about climate change. And the last way, which George Marshall's really big on, is shared values. Climate change threatens shared value here, and that concerns me and you. When it comes to myself, I like turkey hunting back in Pennsylvania with my uncles. And I would say, when was the last time we went to spring or fall gobbler in a coat? We've been hunting in T-shirts for the last 10 years. But if I look at the pictures in the cabin wall and I see everyone in big jackets and they're all bundled up to go to fall gobbler, it's obvious, you can almost see the progression of the warming climate there in Pennsylvania, especially in the Appalachia region. And so, this climate change thing threatens something we both care about. I think we should both be concerned about it. And having that shared value idea. With that, I'm going to give a couple thanks before I take some questions, because I really like questions, and I'm sure you guys have lots. I'd like to thank the Malice Institute for Science Education at Western Michigan U, where one of my colleagues are, the Mathematics and Science Teaching Institute at UNCO, and the Earth and Atmospheric Science Institute at UNCO, because they're the ones that pay my bills. The Science Education Research Group at Mass. I started a Science Education Research Group at UNC. If anybody's interested in joining, I can give you information on that. We meet bi-monthly, talk about education research and how to be better teachers. My co-authors, Heather Pekovic, David Cassidy, and Peter Eklund. The Michigan Space Grant Consortium, who threw me some money during my PhD to help fund some of this research. With that, I'll take questions.